My name's Louise. I'm a survivor of domestic abuse. Today, I'm breaking my silence.
Louise, tell me what your life was like before you met your abuser.
Honestly, it was always kind of a mess. I grew up, my dad was an alcoholic, my mum had suicidal depression, I was neglected, so it was always just a bit of a mess. There was always something going on, and I was always a little bit lost and a little bit looking for affirmation in all the wrong places, which in hindsight is very much how I ended up there. But I think as well, like, people, certain types of people are attracted to that. So my first abusive boyfriend, I was probably 14, and it wasn't really that obvious with him until we broke up, and then he started gaslighting me. But it was something I only really thought about recently, actually, and kind of realised in hindsight. But aside from one or two sort of short-lived relationships throughout my life, it's always been a degree of that kind of abusive imbalance in all of them.
Do you feel like your vulnerability from your childhood was sought out by perpetrators?
Yes, I think I was kind of a magnet for a certain type of partner. I think there's something about the way that I was broken and the way that I just had so much to give, and I was so desperate to belong somewhere that I was willing to change myself and adapt what it was that I wanted, and to sacrifice whatever it was, and to just be enough, because I was always told either that I was too much or that I was somehow too much in a way that stopped me from being enough. And I had such a kind of desperate need to have this security and this home life that I'd never belonged to before, that I was willing to find it at any cost. And I think people can tell, and then they feed off of that, and they need you to be willing to sacrifice that much for them.
Did your abuser ever act like he was the knight in shining armour for you?
100%. Straight away, I'd been married before. I got married quite young. I was 21. And, the first time I just thought, oh, this is it now. That's me. I'm married. I'm going to have 2.4 children. I'm going to have a white picket fence. I'm going to have that life that I've wanted my whole childhood. I never had it. I'm going to have that. And then so when that didn't work out, my worldview was so shaken, and I was incredibly vulnerable. And he, and I had a 2-year-old child then by myself. I was living with my dad again, and he very much came in, not so much like he was saving me, but how he was saving my child from being, that kid with no dad who just gets left and isn't, it was just, he needs a dad, he needs this, and I'm going to be this, and it's going to be okay because I'm here now. And I just kind of let it happen. And I shouldn't have done, but I was still running from so many other things that it was easier just to be distracted and let him save me than it was to face all of the things that I'd been running from and to actually finally learn to save myself.
In hindsight, when you look back, do you see where the abuse became slightly more obvious from him being the knight in shining armour?
It's actually really early on, which is scary. I didn't notice the emotional abuse until much later. After I left, I began to kind of unravel it all. But very soon after we moved in together, we'd sat down to dinner, and I always just have a cup of tea after dinner. Especially, I suppose, at the time, I thought I'm just used to being on my own, so I'm just set in my ways, and I finished my dinner, I got up, I put the kettle on. I tried to put the kettle on. He wouldn't let me get up. And he held on to my wrist and sort of ground it really hard into the dining table. But my dad was there, and he sort of gave me a look when I walked into the kitchen and was like, what? And I was so sort of shocked and embarrassed that I just pretended it hadn't happened, and I just swept it all under the rug. And then I didn't even let myself think about it afterwards, and it set a precedent then for every time that he would hurt me or he would do something wrong. I just carried on justifying it or pretending it hadn't happened. But we'd probably only lived together maybe 2 weeks the first time that he hurt me.
So when you look back, do you see where maybe a trauma bond started to form pretty quickly between yourself and your perpetrator?
I think even like before any of that, like even just when you look at the way that we used to text each other, like it would be constant, like all the time. He was like obsessed with me, and having been in a relationship before that where I was literally just treated like I didn't exist unless someone was watching. Like from he first started texting me, it was all the time, and he like just wanted to consume all the possible information there was to know about me. He was like so interested in everything I had to do and think and say. And I'd come out of a relationship where I guess I was essentially like a little trophy wife, and I was at home completely ignored, like to the point where he literally wouldn't even speak to me in the house. And so off the back of that, this was incredible, but overwhelming and unhealthy in hindsight. But then also, if he didn't say something to me or he disappeared for a bit, it was such a contrast. And that's how the kind of roller coaster of it began, and then was used intentionally later on. Then if I did something he didn't like, or I was going to do something he thought I shouldn't do, and it would just be, like if I was going to have coffee with a friend, like I just had a baby and she just had a baby. So if we had coffee, then we were just literally looking after our kids and doing the exact same thing we'd have been doing at home. But all I would hear then is I would get 3 days of, you don't do anything, you don't make any money, you don't do this. And it wasn't even true. I made the same amount of money he did, even on maternity leave. And then it would go from that to the silent treatment again. And it was literally from the first day he started messaging me, it was like overwhelming from the beginning. And then there would be these periods of like silence where I was punished.
So it seems as though there was a cycle of emotional abuse underlying all the time from the very beginning of your relationship with him.
Yeah, absolutely, like literally. And he would always be like bringing up the fact that I was married before, and it almost seemed like he was angry at me for having been able to leave my husband. And I used to just say to him but we wouldn't be together. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't be having your baby, like we wouldn't be here. And I could never understand it, that he would try to shame me over a situation that meant like he wouldn't have had his kids if I had done what he was having a go at me. Like it just didn't make any sense. And it was always just so confusing, like right from the beginning, that he would in one breath be saying that he wanted to marry me, and I'd be saying like, oh no, I'm never getting married again. And then he'd be angry at me because I'd left my husband. Like it was just confusing and overwhelming and constant all of the time.
Can you remember when the abuse heightened from just emotional, mental to violence?
No, not really. I know the thing like with him grinding my wrist into the table was early on. They weren't often those things. More than that, I didn't realise it at the time. He used to, like, it was when he was being nice, he would like hold me but dig his fingers into like pressure points in the back of my arms. And so he'd be saying all of these like wonderful things, but I'd be in pain, and then I'd be squirming to get away, and I'd hate it when he touched me, but he'd be saying nice things. And so then it made me the bad guy, and he couldn't. And then he would use that to be like, oh, I'm just trying to be nice to you, and you don't even want to be here. You're this, and you're not good enough, and like, you're just nasty. You don't even love me. And I just couldn't understand why I was in pain every time he touched me when he was being kind. But that was far more like insidious. I don't remember that starting. And the same as like the coercion, I think started before I was ever straight up raped by him. And it's all just such a muddle still. Like, it's been 4 years, and there still doesn't very often go by a week where I don't remember something completely new that I'd blacked out until this point. There's a lot of holes in my memory still. It's part of the healing, I know, but it's frustrating.
You mentioned that you were raped by your abuser. At the time, Did you know that you were being raped by him?
Probably not the first time. Sometimes I did. It was very coercive sexually, and there's this kind of stereotypical thing you laugh about where in a relationship, sometimes you just have to take one for the team. But it's really easily twisted in context, and I guess there came a point where I realized that I didn't even like sleeping with him anymore, and that I was performing. I wasn't present. I was thinking, what do I need to say to make him get off quicker? What do I need to do? What way can I move? What way can I do this or that or whatever, just to get it over with as quickly as possible? And then within all of that, and whilst we would be in bed together, he would also be telling me about his ex-girlfriends, and things they used to do, and trying to shame me and tell me I was boring and I didn't do enough, or he would make me watch porn and compare me whilst I was there, and that was always hard, and I always just felt like I needed to just go to the bathroom and scrub myself clean afterwards. None of that really compared. I wrote this blog about coercion a little while ago, and at the end of it there was this thing where I said, about how I got up and left, and I would sit in this scalding hot bath trying to scrub away the shame, and I didn't stay for the man that had put me in that situation. I stayed for the man that would then climb into my bathtub in his pajamas, fully dressed, crying and telling me he was sorry, and he wouldn't even take his pajamas off. He would get fully dressed in, because he knew that I needed that barrier. But this is the same man that made me rape myself, and that was so much worse, because I don't know, emotionally, that I still have never talked about it, that when he did something to me, there was a disconnect from that. When he made me do it to myself, I had to carry myself with me everywhere I went. I couldn't escape it. But then there would be him, and he would be broken, and he would be so sorry, and he would be, literally boiling, turning red in this bathtub that was too hot, and he'd be fully dressed, and he'd be crying, and he'd know he'd done the wrong thing, and he'd know it was too far. And I would just forgive him because I just didn't have the strength not to.
Did you find that throughout the rape, you almost disassociated yourself from what was happening, the reality of the abuse that you were experiencing?
Yeah, I could just think about it. It's almost like watching a film. I would just sort of consciously go through, well, the last time he made me do something, what was it that he really liked about that? What can I do? It was just a very compartmentalized way of thinking about how to get him to where it was he needed to go without actually emotionally letting myself. There's no intimacy when you're like that anymore. But then for every maybe 20 times it'd be like that, and then just once, all of a sudden, it'd be this incredible connective experience again, and then that's what keeps you holding on, isn't it? And then you think, but if it can be like that again in the midst of all of this, and I can have that connection with him, maybe it is going to be okay, and maybe he is sorry, maybe he's not lying, maybe it won't happen again, maybe. But then you end up accidentally pregnant when you said no, and then you have another baby to fight for. And eventually I just kind of snapped and I left. But then I still went back for a year, essentially just sexually. I was just basically a blow-up doll for a year after I left. And I did even more. I left him, and I knew why I'd left him, and I was beginning to understand the extent of some of the abuse. But I still, instead of blaming him, I just tried so much harder. And I do understand that, psychologically, and all the reasons for it now, but it also still doesn't really make sense that somebody could have the kind of control over you where you could leave them because they're treating you so badly, and you could still just be so desperate to fix yourself enough to make them happy.
At what point during the abuse did you start to think, maybe I need to get out, I need to leave?
I didn't leave because of the abuse. I left because he was drinking all the time. And it was getting... I just had a baby. Like, I'd been pregnant 4 times in 3 years. I lost 2, I had 1. I was still breastfeeding her and I got pregnant again. And this time, he started smoking while I was pregnant. And it just was like, you're not addicted to smoking. It's not like a habit that you have. You've chosen, whilst you have a pregnant wife at home, to start smoking. And you know all the statistics and you know how bad that is for your unborn child. And that annoyed me. And I struggled. And then he started coming to bed drunk every night. And he wouldn't come to bed till maybe like 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. And he'd be drunk and he just kept saying it will stop when the baby comes. You know, I'm under a lot of stress right now. It's a lot. Why are you so boring? Just let me have a good time, whatever. I promise it will stop when the baby comes. But the baby came and it didn't stop. And so then I hadn't slept in months because I was co-sleeping with a newborn baby, but the baby couldn't be safe in the middle of the bed like he should. So I had to lay awake in the middle of the bed to stop my drunk husband rolling on my infant son. I had a toddler in the next room that I was still getting up twice a night with, and then I couldn't leave the baby to see to the toddler, and it was really overwhelming, but he just didn't stop drinking. So when I was little, my dad was a drunk, my granddad was a drunk, and I grew up so determined not to be that statistic where children of alcoholics marry alcoholics because it's familiar and comforting and survivable even though you hate it. And all of a sudden, here I was with my drunk husband every day. And eventually we got snowed in, so he couldn't go to work, and we had 2 days trapped in the house. And at this point I had a 5-month-old baby and a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they couldn't go to school, so we were all stuck in the house. And I was doing like everything, and I was trying to feed the baby and the toddler and the 7-year-old, and everybody wanted something different every minute, and they were crying and they were, "Mummy, when's this and when's that?" And he just sat there, and it wasn't even lunchtime yet, and he just sat there and cracked a beer. And I just looked at him like, can you look at your life and what's going on? And we are the people that you say you love, and you're not doing anything. And I was really dramatic. I wrote the time and the date down on a piece of paper and slammed it down on the table in front of him, and I was like, I'm calling it. And he just looked at me, he was like, what? I was like, time of death. And I was just like, I was overly dramatic. But then we were still stuck in the house together. But I just could not I couldn't bridge the gap in my mind between all the things he was saying and then him just sitting there and cracking a beer at like not even 12 o'clock in the afternoon, while he has these kids that he wanted so much, and, you know, like this life that is everything he said he ever wanted, and yet he's doing nothing. Like, they all need something, and they all need a lot. They're all little. They all need a lot all the time. And I can't do it all by myself all the time. I'm just not 3 people. I can't be pulled in that many directions. And he would just sit there and watch, and then he would get annoyed at me that his life looked chaotic instead of just stepping in and doing something. And that was, in that moment, I snapped and I kicked him out. And then as soon as he found somewhere to go, he went. But then I was like really consumed afterwards by the idea that I'd broken it and I needed to fix it. So we were supposed to go to couples counselling. So we went for the first kind of meeting with the lady that headed up the program for that. And he used to just be able to say things. He was really, really clever at saying things that sounded good to everybody else, but he knew would upset me or hurt me, or that I would like question, and then I would look like I was the arsehole. And I can't even remember what he said now, but he did it in the thing, and I was like, well, that's ambiguous, like. And then he went, oh, you're crazy, you don't even want this, you're not really trying, you kicked me out, I don't have to be here, you need to see your own counsellor, you're bipolar anyway. So the lady in the meeting then, she set me up with my own counsellor, and he was supposed to see his own counsellor, and I think he went twice and then was like, no, I'm not going anymore. But I stuck with that I went every week for months. And at the time, she used to say things to me or ask me things, or she would just tell me stories about her life. And I used to just be like, yeah, it's interesting, but I don't know why you're telling me. But then it was a few months after I stopped seeing her, we got back together. And then he would do something, and I would hear her telling me the story. And I'd just go like, oh. And we got back together at the end of September. And on the Christmas day, he literally, I can only describe it as he threw a tantrum like a toddler. We'd gotten Christmas cards, like separate Christmas cards. All of his family had sent Christmas cards, one to me addressed with my parents, and then separate ones to him and the kids. And I was like, I don't understand why they've done that. And he was like, well, they just don't know any different. I'm like, well, why don't they know any different? Because it's not their fault. Like, the only information they have is what you give them. And he was like, are you saying it's my fault? And I was like, well, yeah, it kind of is your fault. And he just lost it. And I was like, I wasn't even like blaming you or saying anything nasty. I was just like, yeah, well, because they only know what you've told them. And I mean, he was screaming and crying, and he threw himself down on the bed. He looked like he was having a fit. Like, his arms and legs were flailing. It was like, you know, when you take your 2-year-old to Tesco's and you don't let them have gummy bears. Like, it was that, but in a grown man. And it was terrifying. And it was the first time that I really objectively looked at the situation, because it's not even like it was new. It was just that I was looking at it differently. And instead, well, to be fair, I essentially behaved the same way, but for different reasons. And I fully pandered to him, and I just needed to keep my kids safe. So, but normally I would be in that situation and I would be devastated that it was my fault and I'd done this to him. Whereas this time I looked at it and I was just like, I just need to keep my kids safe. I just need to make this stop. I need to get through the day. I need to make a Christmas dinner, and then I need to get out of here. And then I didn't really communicate very much with him for a few days, and he sent me a message on New Year's Day. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. And he said to me, I'm going to stop studying at 3 o'clock and have a drink. Either I'll be drinking because I'm single, or I'll be drinking because I've got a wife that's worth having. And I just was like, kind of, you might as well crack a drink now because I'm done. But that was from February the year before, up and down. I was at his beck and call for a year. If he wanted to get laid, I'd go running. And he would just turn up unannounced 4 or 5 days in a row and see the kids for like 3 minutes and get them all wound up and then leave. And then they wouldn't hear from him for 3 weeks. And it was a long time getting to that point. But eventually, with the counselling and the questions that she'd asked me playing in my mind in the background, I was able to just go, do you know what? My kids deserve better than this.
After you left, was that when you started to process what really had been happening, all the domestic abuse that you had experienced?
I think the first time I started to process it properly is he'd been, that whole year, he'd been making a mess out of the kids' schedule. He'd turn up, he'd disappear, he'd turn up again, he'd turn up again. He'd turn up when I was at the park and at my friends' houses, or, you know, and it was such a mess. In the end, I went to a mediator and I tried to explain the situation, and I just wanted a fixed schedule so that they would know when to expect him, and I also wouldn't just feel blindsided or be standing in the park waiting for him to somehow know I was there and turn up and mess everything about, and it was just unsettling, just the not knowing. So I just wanted a schedule. And I went to this mediator because he wouldn't listen to me. He wouldn't communicate about it at all. He would just start a row or just make something else my fault or deflect. And she asked me what to expect when she met with him. And I just said, he's very charismatic. He'll be very charming. You don't have to worry. And she just looked at me, she went, oh, honey, they always are. And it was the first time that it wasn't just me being crazy. And he wouldn't meet with her either in the end. But the texting was still carrying on all the time. 1 minute he was abusive, the next minute he was in love with me. But I just was able to take a step back by that point and just look at it and go like, and I started feeling a little bit, I'd reconnected with some of my friends. I'd been so isolated before, not because he ever told me you aren't allowed to see your friends, but because I'd have to listen to him whine about me doing nothing and being nothing for 3 days afterwards. It just wasn't worth the hassle. But I'd started to reconnect with some of my friends, and a couple of them saw messages at different times ping up on my phone, and they were like, if he's picking your kids up, you need someone else to be there. That's not safe. And so I guess then I started being able to open up to people about it a little bit. And I started writing. I was asked to just write a blog for a guest blog. I was never intending to do it on my own social media or anything like that, about why I was a single parent. And I'd never told anybody why I was a single parent. And I just was like, I don't know how to tell this story without telling all of it. And in the end, I thought, well, I just wrote it. And I was like, well, I'm never going to post it on mine. It's never going to come back to me. I can do it, they're just going to post it on their general parenting forum and it'll be an interesting thing or whatever. But in the end, I posted it on mine about a month later and I didn't even read it again. I was absolutely bricking it and I just blind copy and pasted it. And then I turned my phone off and I just walked away. And it was literally like maybe a good day later, maybe 2. I turned my phone on and my DMs were just full of women saying, I think you just wrote my life. And I realized then that I wasn't crazy and that actually this is a huge problem. And there were so many women that just said to me, and it was the amount of women that didn't comment or like my picture. They said, like, I literally couldn't even like your image. I'm sending you this now and then I'm going to delete it because it can't stay on my phone, but I want you to know you're my hero and that I feel less alone because of you. And then I like to learn. Like I hated school. I didn't go very often, but I've always liked to learn. And that kind of started me on a journey of just consuming as much information as I could, not just about domestic abuse, but about myself and psychologically trying to understand myself and how I ended up in this position and what I could do to fix it and how I could become like a bridge between the problem and the women that were alone in that. And if there was a way I could write things that inspired people to make changes, or even just if they couldn't make changes, if they didn't have the strength for that, but they at least could sit crying on the bathroom floor and knowing they weren't the only person in the world that felt that way or that they couldn't cope. And it's been a long healing journey, but I am not the same woman I was then. And it gave me purpose, like sometimes I think, like it's not a journey, I wouldn't have chosen it and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, but I don't regret it either because the thing that broke me also built me and I wouldn't be here now and I wouldn't have the purpose I have in life and I kind of started running an empowerment course for women locally in the community. They get referred from a key worker and they're generally, they have depression or addiction or they have OCD, they have all sorts, like millions and like different issues, but every single woman that I've spoken to on that course has a domestic abuse story buried in there somewhere. And the difference that you find just talking to people again, and all different women from all different walks of life, different cultures, races, socioeconomic backgrounds, their educational background is different. Everybody is so completely unique, and yet there's this one thread that runs through each of their stories, and it's I was abused.
With the knowledge and education you have now on domestic abuse, if you could go back in time to that version of you, what advice would you give yourself?
If I was to go far enough back in time, I think I just need to tell myself to know myself. I didn't ever invest in myself because I didn't believe in myself, but the offshoot of that is I never really stopped to think about what I liked or what made me happy, and so then I was just far too susceptible to adapting to what somebody else thought I should be, and I never stopped to question, is this what I like? Is this what I don't like? Is this going to make me happy? Do I even want to do that? And I think if I had just had a stronger sense of who I was to begin with, and I had taken that time, then I'd have maybe known my own mind, and maybe just a little bit earlier been able to just say, no, I don't want to. I think that I think the thing most overarchingly I need to tell myself at all of the stages over the years is to be a little bit more gentle on myself. I have been a perfectionist. I think probably because I've felt so out of control in so many ways that I've tried too hard and I've put myself under too much pressure, and I've never given myself the freedom to fail at anything. And everybody needs that. Failing isn't the end. It's like a really beautiful story in which you get to rise again. And I would tell my younger self, 1, take a breath, get to know who you are, and 2, like, it's okay. You can fail. You can mess it up. It actually just makes you stronger and better and more interesting in the end. And who you're gonna be is incredible, and you're gonna change the fucking world, so just crack on.